Okay, welcome everybody. I am Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Coordinator. Thank you so much for joining us for our David Gessner Stewardship Lecture, which is part of the Concord Festival of Authors. The Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this past April we celebrated our 30th anniversary. David Gessner, our guest tonight, is the author of 11 books that blend a love of nature, humor, memoir, and environmentalism, including Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness, which he will discuss tonight. His awards include a Pushcart Prize, the John Burroughs Award for Best Nature Essay, the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment Award for Best Book of Creative Writing, and the Reed Award for Best Book on the Southern Environment. In 2017, he hosted the National Geographic Explorer show, The Call of the Wild. In Leave It As It Is, Gessner travels to the Dakota Badlands, where Roosevelt awakened as a naturalist, to Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon, where Roosevelt escaped during the grind of his re-election tour. And finally, to Bears Ears, Utah, a monument proposed by Native tribes that is embroiled in a national conservation fight. Along the way, Gessner questions and reimagines Roosevelt's vision for today. It's a fabulous book that shows the comfort and inspiration our heroes can often bring, but a book that also questions them, asking how we can do better, what we can do as individuals, as a society to make our planet safer, clearer, and more inclusive. I hope some of you have read the book, and if not, you can buy signed copies of it in our Walden Woods online shop, and I will post the link for that in the chat in a minute. Just to go over some Zoom housekeeping, this is a webinar, so you are only able to see myself and the panelists. If you have any technical difficulty, just use the chat and I'll do my best to help everyone out. There will be a Q&A at the end of our event, so any questions about the book or just for David, feel free to type them in the Q&A box and we will address them at the end. And with that, welcome, David.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to be here.
Yeah, so like I said, I really enjoyed the book. Not only learned a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, but also the environmental movement, specifically the often overlooked battles that continue today, like the one in Bears Ears, which the book really dives into. And I was talking to you just about this before, but it seems fitting that the book mentions Bill McKibben at the end. We had him for a TED Talk last week or a few weeks ago, and during his Q&A, people were asking a lot about the cattle industry, its effect on the environment. So your book, I think, actually really complements that question for people who want to learn more, perhaps understand those concerns a little more. So with that, I'll let you jump in, start talking about the book. I'll launch it off with a general question about the three threads that kind of run throughout. If you want to take us maybe briefly through each thread, surprises that came up, if the threads were something that you planned. And I know you have a special guest, so you can introduce him when you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you. And I don't know if Jeff Kramer is here. I know he's had a hard fall, and I just want to thank him too for having me. Maybe the result of tonight is I will finally pronounce Thoreau correctly. It's been a long, troubled Thoreau history for me, but I do appreciate you guys having me here. Funny story about Bill McKibben. We were on the Harvard Crimson together many years ago, and a little aside, Jeffrey Toobin was also on the same Crimson, though I didn't know him, still don't. And I drew a cartoon, which I've actually been writing about lately because it's come back as it's kind of gone viral. I never thought it would, of Ronald Reagan seen from the back urinating on a homeless person in the gutter, and the cartoon was called The Trickle-Down Theory. And this was at the birth of the conservative college newspapers too in the early 80s. And Bill McKibben stood by me during the attacks on my attack. And so it's just kind of an interesting, I had him down to Wilmington, where I teach, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, after Hurricane Florence to talk about climate change. So two things before I answer your question that I'm going to do that I never have done on these. You start feeling like a politician, you're kind of repeating yourself. And I wanted to do things a little different. And the first, given who's hosting me, is I wanted to put on my mask.
Oh, awesome.
From Walden Woods, which creeps everybody out and says they say I look like a bird and that the lips actually move. My Thoreau mask. And I wanted to say that during the pandemic, I started fairly early on. I wrote a piece for the American Scholar about Thoreau, and I'm going to just call him Thoreau for tonight. I'll work on my pronunciation later, about Thoreau and the lessons he had to teach. I'm wary of the word lessons, but the lessons he had to teach of staying close to home, of civil disobedience, of learning our place. So I wrote an essay early on, and then I wrote another essay for Sierra magazine about rewilding. I'd seen that picture many of you have probably seen of the mountain lions walking through Boulder in the snow. And you see the Himalayas again and all this rewilding that was happening. Anyway, one thing led to another, and even though I was bringing this book out, I started writing a new book. And lo and behold, 2 weeks ago, I signed a contract, which means I have to deliver it, or have delivered it last week, and it'll come out in May. And it's about, originally the title was Pan and Pandemic, but we're working on a new title right now. So hopefully I'll be coming to talk to you again about Henry. Right now I'm going to talk to you about Teddy. I thought what I do, another thing I haven't done much, is read from the book.
Yeah, that's great.
I generally don't read. My wife always says when people are read to, they go to sleep. But since you mentioned the climate situation and Bill McKibben, I thought I'd read one small section that deals with that, and then I'll answer your question about the three threads. Scientists now tell us that the situation could not be more dire. They tell us we have 12 years left as of this writing until we have ruined the planet for our children and their children. What if we really believed that? And why don't we believe it? What would we do differently? How would we live differently? If we really believed what our scientists are telling us, wouldn't we drop everything else and do whatever we possibly could to resist exploiting, denuding, and destroying our wilderness? Wouldn't we do this with an urgency we have never felt before, as if our lives depended on it, for the simple reason that they do? We are like the bad student who has blown off work all term and now is forced to pull an all-nighter. Preserving land is not some antiquated idea that plays no role in our current fight. We need some places that are not shattered, fracked, and torn apart. We need to let places heal, not just to save our present, but in the hopes of a future different from the one scientists tell us is coming. As I look toward that future, I don't want to abandon the past. What TR left us with, on top of the gift of the land itself, was a story of wildness. It's a damn good story, one that has worked quite effectively for over a century. As we have discovered, there are flaws in this story, some due to the times he lived in, and some due to his own biases. Roosevelt is dead, and so he can't revise his story. That is up to us. We need to tell a new story about wilderness for a new time. With any luck, we can tell a story half as inspired as his. We likely won't, but we must try. We owe it to the land and to the animals and to ourselves to try. So to get to your question about the threads, that's one of the threads, kind of an environmental battle cry. The other thread is a condensed biography of Teddy Roosevelt. I do not claim to be a biographer on the scale of Edmund Morris and the great biographers, but I do try to take his life and use it toward the end of talking about wilderness and how we might be able to save wilderness. Important here is my hero as a biographer was my college professor, Walter Jackson Bate, who loved what Samuel Johnson said about biography, that we need to take what can be put to use in our own lives in biography. And that's what I try to do in this book with Roosevelt. So that's the second thread. And the third thread is a road trip that I take following the places that were important to Roosevelt, up the East Coast to Harvard, then out to the Badlands, to Yellowstone, to Yosemite. And I do that with my 21-year-old nephew who's just graduated from college, University of North Carolina, Asheville. And he's kind of a counterweight during the book. He thinks Teddy's a little ridiculous. I asked him who his hero was, and he said, the Dude. And he just read a book, The Tao of the Dude, Big Lebowski. And so when he, I would play books on tape as we were driving and Roosevelt speeches, and he would start to roll his eyes and he'd say, I never want to hear the phrase manly vigor ever again. So, he's a nice counterbalance, and he is a way of letting me explore some of Roosevelt's flaws. And so these three things kind of weave together. In recent years, I'd like to I had a professor in Colorado, Reg Sonner, who talked about, who was a mountaineer and a poet. He talked about the pleasures of the difficult. So when I've done these books, I've tried to, make them complex, weave a lot of things and cut back and forth between them. So this book really began, I guess, in full on October 27th, 2017. That was the day that Ryan Zinke, then Secretary of the Interior, standing in front of a portrait of Roosevelt and on Roosevelt's, what would have been his 159th birthday, and declaring himself a Roosevelt Republican, undeclared Bears Ears National Monument. And that is what inspired me to dive into this book, which is partly about the Antiquities Act and about Bears Ears National Monument and about Roosevelt. Earlier than that, well, to go way back to where it really begins, I had testicular cancer when I was in Worcester, Massachusetts, my hometown, when I was 30. And during that spring, which is of radiation, in which I wrote in my journal, I don't know what's worse, Worcester or cancer. No offense, Worcester, I was in a bad mood at the time. I got rejected by all the writing schools I applied to except for one. And that was in Boulder, Colorado. You can kind of see Boulder, the Flatirons back there. I was kind of airlifted out of Worcester into Colorado, and I really felt, not to sound like John Denver, but I felt like my life began again in the West. And part of that life was traveling to Southeast Utah. And if you haven't been to Utah, if you've only seen Star Trek movies, you got to go there and experience it because it's an amazing place. So I wrote about Utah, and I still clung to it when I moved first back to Cape Cod and then down here to North Carolina. And when Bears Ears was being conceived, and I'll get into the conception, well, let me do that right now because that's the order. So that's my love of Utah. Then this landscape that I loved was much more deeply loved and revered by 5 tribes: the Navajo, the Ute Mountain Ute, the Hopi, and the Zuni, who 6 or 7 years ago began to study the land and try to preserve this land, Bears Ears, under the Antiquities Act as a national monument. And they, people said, oh, it was a rash decision. No, it wasn't. It was this well thought out, long decision to save the land. And that was the land that Obama declared right before he left office in December 2016. And right before he did that, a book was distributed to all the members of Congress. And I was the kind of the token Easterner. I had an essay in there. And when Bears Ears was declared, I felt jubilant, thrilled. So 10 months later, when Zinke undeclared it, I felt kind of crashed to the ground like a body slam in pro wrestling. So that was the experience of how the book began. And then I headed out west for a scouting mission before I did the long trip with Noah. And the first person I met was Regina Lopez White Skunk, Ute Mountain Ute. And she was fantastic. She was one of the members of the Bears Ears Commission. And she said to me, look, we're not trying to relive historical trauma here. We're not trying to say we want our land back. What we're trying to do is use a tool of the American government, the Antiquities Act, in a new way to save the sacred land. So it seemed to me this great vision of a new way to use the old Teddy Roosevelt draft to create a more inclusive, less touristy, more open vision of saving public land. So that's where the book began. And then we took our trip. And what I tried to do in the book is wherever we went on the trip, I'd weave in some Roosevelt biography. And of course, one of the most famous moments in that biography is when the young Roosevelt leaves behind his Eastern roots. You know, he grew up, much like Mr. Trump, he grew up wealthy in New York. He also had small hands like Mr. Trump, this is true. Very different in other ways. He read a book a night and was a voracious reader and a grower, really. But when he's 24, he loses his wife and his mom within a course of one day. And he's just crushed, as you can imagine. And this Easterner, who's a bit of a fop, a bit of a dandy, heads west to the Badlands. And I follow him on my trip and write about it. But in the Badlands, as anyone who's read Edmund Morris's book or any of the Roosevelt Chronicles, he kind of transforms. He becomes this kind of hardy Westerner. He throws himself into ranching. There's one scene I just love that I always have to jam in there, which is he's built this ranch and he's got his two actually ranch hands from Maine with him, and some boat thieves steal the boat and his boat and go up the Little Missouri. It's during an ice storm and there are ice blocks everywhere. So they build a boat and go chasing after them. Roosevelt goes chasing after him. But first he grabs Anna Karenina off the shelf so he can read Tolstoy in the back of the boat while they're chasing down the boat thieves that they eventually arrest. So to me, this was really thrilling, this idea, and it's a Thoreauvian ideal in a way of uniting kind of the primitive and savage with the intellectual. And Roosevelt does this all throughout his career. You know, he'll be in the Oval Office and he'll come rushing into a cabinet meeting and say, "I have important news." And they'll say, "What?" And he said, "I saw a chestnut-sided warbler, and it's only February." You know, this is something we can't quite imagine a leader doing now. We also can't imagine a leader respecting science and believing in science. The thing is, when Roosevelt was 14, he trained himself rather, not to be a soldier, not to be a leader, but to be a working naturalist like his hero, Charles Darwin. And he starts to learn his birds. And it's through his birds that he starts to write. And this guy eventually writes 47 books, so it's pretty impressive. So basically, I wanted to frame the book with my road trip. And we went up to Massachusetts. We headed out west. And then it really begins in the Badlands where Noah, who's going west for the first time, or second time really, but we wake up and look out the tent and there are some buffalo snuffling along in the grass. The next stop we made was in Medora, which was where Roosevelt, I call it like, it's Teddyland, like Disneyland. And Roosevelt is Mickey Mouse, basically. He's everywhere. And Noah and I were on our way to our campsite in Medora, because I really believed you need to know these places to know the man, right? And we were on our way there, and we stopped at this building, really to use the bathroom. And we were walking through, and lo and behold, Teddy Roosevelt came walking across the lobby. And suddenly we were talking to this Teddy, and I'm going to invite him in right now because I tracked him down for my talks. And Larry Marple is a great Roosevelt imitator who's been doing these things with me. And here he is. Welcome, Larry. Hello, did I call you Larry? I'm blowing our whole shtick. Welcome, Teddy. Oh, you might be muted. It even happens to you. I didn't think you could be muted.
Ah, Congress tried to do that.
Yes, they often did.
So I just said, I answer to many things.
You do. Colonel, TR. Yeah. So I thought we would start by talking, you know, my trip mimicked a famous trip that you took, which is actually in the news today because of Mr. Biden's train trip on Amtrak that you took. But you were the first one to have what we call a whistle stop tour, and really the first president to run for re-election to get out there. And in 1903, you did what ended up being a 16,000-mile trip across the country. You went back to Medora and said hi to old friends. And I wondered if we could pick it up a little bit, maybe in Yellowstone, where you had a pretty shocking time for a sitting president.
Yes, our 1903 tour started in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but eventually on April 8th, we made it to Gardner, Montana. And John Burroughs and I, the great naturalist, we spent 2 weeks in Yellowstone. We traipsed through the woods, we camped, and had a bully time. But
you left your Secret Service and the media
yes.
behind, and you were off on your own in the wilderness.
Yes, they wished to have a large banquet, and I wanted nothing with that. I wanted to be with Mr. Burroughs out in nature.
Well, when in the book I wrote about, partly about you, I use little segments like kind of interludes where I write in the third person imagining I'm you. And the section I do about Yellowstone is the day you wandered off and studied the elk for hours and counted and watched. And I said, you know, Rosa, you, no offense, deserve to be criticized for quite a few things, including your attitude toward Native people. But that quality of being absorbed, of loving wildness and wilderness, I believe that internally is what allowed you to externally save so much land.
Yeah.
That love, basically, is probably the word.
Well, where you are right now, I had great influence from Mr. Thoreau. When I would read his books, and I know his works influenced Mr. Muir and Mr. Burroughs as well. So, no, it was to be out there with Mr. Burroughs, and not just with the elk, but with the birds, and to somewhat competitively identify the bird calls.
Yeah, he was much better than that than Muir was. Muir wasn't so good.
Oh, yes. Now, Mr. Muir was concerned more with the scenery, the plants, the trees, where Mr. Burroughs was more interested in the animals and the other living things as well. So
if we continue your journey,
yes,
west and south, you then come to the Grand Canyon,
yes,
which you've never seen before. And in fact, the morning you give your famous speech that gives my book its title, was the first time you kind of snuck up there on horseback and saw the great purple bruise of the canyon. And I was hoping for the audience that you could recite some of the Leave It As It Is speech.
Oh, I would be delighted. Yes, we arrived at the Grand Canyon on May 6th, and as I stood at the edge of that majestic canyon, I said, in the Grand Canyon, Arizona has a natural wonder, which, so far as I know, is in kind absolutely unparalleled throughout the rest of the world. I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it, in your own interest and in the interest of the country, to keep this great wonder of nature as it now is. I was delighted to learn of the wisdom of the Santa Fe Railroad people in deciding not to build their hotel on the brink of the canyon. I hope you will not have a building of any kind, not a summer cottage, a hotel, or anything else to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness, the beauty of the canyon. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is to keep it for your children and your children's children, and for all who come after you, as one of the great sights which every American, if he can travel at all, should see.
Thank you. Rousing. That's the scene with which my book begins. And I think that speech, I kind of deconstruct it in the book. You know, so many things there we now maybe consider environmental cliches like children's children. But what Roosevelt was doing was groundbreaking. And one of the things he was doing was creating the language in which we fought the environmental fight, but also creating the arena in which it was fought. You know, this was unheard of, to leave it things as they were. Another note, the Niagara Falls was kind of the great foil here. A lot of conservationists saw Niagara Falls and what had happened there and did not want that to happen to our other spectacular places. And I've always loved the children's line because it connects us by blood to the future. It tells us it's something we could use now. This idea that think ahead and beyond your life, particularly as you get older. One of the things that really motivated my book, this is the most activist book I've done. And one of the reasons was I have a 17-year-old daughter who's involved in Bill McKibben's Sunrise group. And I have grad students and college students for whom climate is not some theoretical thing. It's something that causes them day-to-day anxiety, and it's something that's here for them. I mean, we live down here in the hurricane bullseye. The West is on fire. So these are real things for them, and they need to be more real for us. I understand politically why they're not brought up in the debates right now, but it's ridiculous for us not to appreciate that this is our fight. And one thing you did throughout your 2 terms, almost 2 full terms, was always keep conservation as one of your top 3 priorities.
No, I said that there can be no greater issue than that of the conservation of our natural wonders. Yes. Yep. And I had to fight Congress for that.
And I think you also said there's nothing more practical than the preservation of beauty.
Yes.
I love that combo. 2 things. So we leave the Grand Canyon, and the next famous stop is heading into Yosemite, or as some are calling it now, Yosemite or Yosemite. And we head in on a camping trip.
Yes.
The night I think you're supposed to be at a big gala affair with the bigwigs, and you skirted civilization with John Muir, and you headed in, and I write about this one also in the 3rd person, kind of picturing that night. You want to take us through a couple of the details of that night?
Yes. Well, we arrived at Raymond, California on May 15th, and of all the people in the world, Mr. John Muir was the one with whom I thought it would be best to see Yosemite. So I had read his book on our parks in 1901 when he published that. So we camped our first night on May 15th in the Mariposa Grove under the grizzly giant. I had 40 wool army blankets for my bedding. Then the next evening, we camped at Sentinel Dome, and we had a snowstorm. About 5 inches of snow fell upon us. But the last night, May 17th, we camped at the edge of Bridal Veil Meadow in the Yosemite Valley. Mr. Muir and I discussed many things, but one of his favorite practices was putting little twigs into the buttonholes of my coat. I would brush those off, but we did develop a good rapport with each other. But Mr. Muir's main focus was the conservation and mostly preservation of the forest. His concern was that the California state grant of Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove, which was surrounded in 1892 by the Yosemite National Park, that those should be receded to the United States for federal protection. Our discussion eventually prompted me in 1906 in June to have the Yosemite Recession Bill passed. This took the Yosemite Valley land grant and the Mariposa Big Tree Grove from state protection to federal protection as part of Yosemite National Park.
We were talking about kind of tracing Thoreau's influence, and his writing on parks actually factored into Muir's early thinking on parks, which led to yours. So it's really pretty fascinating that a figure who he's not quite as unknown as he's made out to be when he died, but he's initially revived with Emerson's eulogy, but then later, that this figure who, his reputation kind of slept for a while, had such massive influence later on Muir, and indirectly, at least, on you too.
Well, there have been those who referred to my Elkhorn Ranch, which was my home ranch in North Dakota, as the Walden Pond of the West.
Well, let me take us in a slightly different direction, which is in the section I write in the 3rd person about your night with Mr. Muir. I show up, which I didn't really do because I'm old, but I'm not that old. And I show up and I tell them a little bit about the future. And I also bring in certain criticisms. One of the things that I criticize in the book is that we took so much of this parkland from indigenous people. And I questioned some of the basics. And Wallace Stegner called parks America's best idea. And I say, well, it's America's pretty good idea, but let's make it a better idea for the future. And it's been an interesting summer, of course, for you. I don't know if you know this because you've been kind of resting quietly. Where do you rest anyway? On Long Island, or is
Yes,
that where?
in the Young Cemetery at the edge of the lane, the end of the lane that leads to my house in Oyster Bay, our home at
What a house that is, boy! So
Oh.
beautiful up on that hill, and with those rocking chairs. I know you like to move, so you were even
Yes.
moving when you were sitting. It was pretty impressive.
Very
But so this summer, where my books come out, you've been in the news. You'd love it. As you know, well, you don't even know this because it was after you died. Your daughter said of you, "My father wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening." And
That's
so
how
in
I
this,
am.
you share some qualities with our current president. You have great differences from him as well. And this summer, well, just last week when we were in Portland, your statue came down there, and your statue's scheduled to come down in front of the Natural History Museum that your father partly started. But in a compensating gesture, they have renamed their Hall of Biodiversity after you. So to me, you seem a great, important figure right now in an age where we cancel our ancestors when we say they don't live up to snuff to our standards. And you have so much positive you offered, and yet you're trapped in your time, and sometimes even behind your time. So I think it's really important for us to look at our past, acknowledge the problems with it, but also take what's good.
Very much. Yes.
Yeah. So that's my take, and that's what I hope I wasn't too mean to you in my book. I tried to be balanced. I know you can take a punch.
Yes.
You were not afraid of.
That's how I lost the sight in my left eye when I was in the White House, taking a punch from a Navy midshipman while we were boxing.
Which is a wonderful segue into another part of the book where I actually stage a fight between you and Mr. Trump. You did box and you did jujitsu.
Yes.
And he's a very big man. I don't know if you've seen pictures, but he would have the advantage in pure bulk. But I'm betting on you, and in a debate, which we're going to have later tonight, I think that's where you really shine. Because one of the reasons I came back to write about you and to write this book was because it was an example of an educated, smart, voracious reader who was versed in intellectual areas, but also able to use language and distill it to inspire people. And I think you could have led the climate fight. It's a very hard fight because it's a very vague enemy. I think you could have done it. And I think that just as you took on the trusts and monopolies, you would take on the fossil fuel industries. And we really need someone who's willing to do that.
Well, I had that fight with Congress while I was president. Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, said not 1 cent for scenery. So it was an uphill battle frequently to have any of the 230 million acres of land that I set aside to have any of that saved.
Well, there's this guy, Mitch McConnell, who you never met. I don't know how you do against him. He's a stubborn character. So, I think we're ready for questions. If there are any, we can go in any direction. We'd love to interact with you guys.
Yeah, so with that, we'll start our Q&A. Use the Q&A little chat box on the bottom of the screen. The Walden Woods Project does have some questions. So we'll ask those while folks have time to type in theirs.
And we were saying earlier that it's too bad. I think the technology is going to evolve. It'd be great to be able to see people. You guys are all out there in the dark. One day we'll figure this out where it's
Yeah.
more interactive.
So the first question, I think you both could answer this. Teddy and I were talking about it behind the scenes before, but thorough is mentioned obviously a few times in the book. I don't want to assume you're a Thoreauvian, David or Teddy, but did his writings help at all in your writing of the book? Did you find yourself turning to his work more than you thought you would, or just throughout? And Teddy, if you could talk a little bit about Thoreau's impact on your presidency and in your life and writing too.
Well, I'd be happy to start. I think some people in the audience have read the piece I wrote. And my first book was called A Wild Rank Place 25 years ago. And the full quote is a Thoreau quote. It is a wild rank place and there is no flattery in it, talking about Cape Cod. And I used that quote in two ways. I was writing about my blunt businessman father from Worcester, whose favorite expression was no bullshit. He seemed like a pretty wild rank character too, but also about the landscape of the Cape. And this current book, or the forthcoming book, you mentioned earlier in the queue, before we backstage, if I was getting sick of talking about Teddy Roosevelt. Close your eyes, Teddy. Close your ears. I've once wrote a book called Sick of Nature, and my line is, everybody's next book should be called Sick of the Last Book, because by the time you're done talking about it, you're ready for something new. And what I'm ready for is thorough. And I think I might have actually said it correctly that time for the first time in my life. So that book begins with a scene that I've recounted a few times, which is 17 years ago, or maybe 16 and a half, when my daughter's 1. We're walking into Walden, and she's up on my shoulders, and I'm with my wife. And we walk to near where the foundation, where the cabin was, and I point and I say, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. I say to Hadley, my daughter, and I mean ruined in a good way mostly. Reading him in high school, and then more in college, I suddenly gave up plans to be a lawyer, to follow a normal career, and I suddenly started writing and keeping journals. And one of the things that the new book is about is this writing shack I built behind my house, which there's no doubt who inspired that. So yeah, he's interwoven in everything I write, basically. And this book, Teddy's a little more pugnacious, though Thoreau certainly wasn't shy about battling. But it's a big part of what I do.
Well, in Thoreau's writings, he argued that every community across America should have a park where, I think his words were, where a stick should never be cut for fuel, and it should be preserved. So I put Thoreau's ideal of conserving our forests into action. I set aside land for preservation and conservation.
Yeah. If Thoreau had drunk more coffee, he might have been like you.
Yes, I drink a gallon of coffee a day.
Yep, and Thoreau drank no coffee because he did not want to depend on anything.
Water is the only drink for a wise man.
Yep.
Right?
I don't agree. I don't know. What about Scotch?
I don't think he drank.
I never did drink.
We really should have Jeff on here so he can answer our Thoreau questions. Someone asked if we could show the book. I have a copy right here. David, I don't know if you have your own copy you want to show, but this is the book.
Yes. Woohoo.
And if you and David did a nice little sketch of Teddy in our signed copies, so you can always get an edition of that. Next question is regarding authorial influences. Did you find Wilderness Warrior by Doug Brinkley to be helpful, and were there limitations of its account that you sought to overcome?
All right. I've avoided this. Teddy has not heard me utter this. I've avoided this, and I'm going to try to do this gracefully. Let me put it this way. I've been reviewed a lot by historians. And one thing historians do when they review you that drives me crazy is they don't talk about the writing. I'm not a historian. I'm not a biographer. I'm a biographical adventurer, and I'm a writer. And I'm pleased with the writing in the book. Nary a mention in the reviews. Putting it politely, Douglas Brinkley is a historian and a biographer. For me, the writing was not at a super high level, and it was certainly an amazingly useful book for me in terms of research, and it's also a good doorstop. It's very big, but you know, he's just a different kind of writer than I am, and he's after something different. So, but it's exhaustive, and gets all the I certainly went to it and used it as a resource. How's that?
Great. And that was an audience question.
I know. Hopefully
Okay.
it wasn't from Douglas Brinkley.
Yeah. No, it wasn't.
I loved it, Doug. It was beautiful. Get back to me. Have your agent get back to me, baby.
Another question. One of my favorite quotes from all your books you've written came from my Green Manifesto. What piece of advice would you give an inspiring journalist?
It's funny because where we are, I mean, we're nowhere because we're on the web and online, but I imagine us in Massachusetts, and that's kind of my book about the Charles River. And it's also the book where I talk most about limited wild and small wilderness, and really relevant to what we're doing, what's happening right now in the pandemic. As far as advice, I think that book might be a good model. I deal a lot with literary writers, grad students who are writing these beautiful descriptions of things, and sometimes they need to be shaken out a little bit and have more story. So go on an adventure, go down the Charles River, go follow Teddy, do something, and bring your lyric, beautiful writing along with you. And then you have both the verve of a story that is engaging, and you still have that lyric writing. Now, sometimes, like a novelist, a lot of the early fiction is autobiographical. So maybe your nonfiction is that way too. But eventually, get out on the road, get out and do something, and write about that as you go. I guess that would be my advice. And do something big, and get in touch with experts. They love to talk, and learn about something. I think that's my advice.
That's awesome advice. More advice from Theodore and David. We have a teacher here, and she says, advice to give students about how we can get politicians and people to get serious about climate change.
Would you like, well, one advice I would give that I stressed with my children and with all those who worked in my administration was tell the truth. Make sure you tell the children the truth. Let them know exactly what is going on. And make sure, as I did with conservation, tell what was at stake. Make sure that everyone understands what is at stake. And so when you do that and you tell the truth with them, it will inspire.
And this is one that, I'm sure Teddy would second, which is get out into it.
Yes.
And I wrote in my Green Manifesto that we only fight for what we love. And so getting people out into it is part of it. And I think that, it's right here. It's in our face. We're experiencing. It's not like something vaguely in our future. Everything that McKibben wrote about 25 years ago has come to pass, and we're in it. So it is time. I'm also a Churchill buff, and for a similar reason. In the face of an enemy, being able to distill and articulate why we should fight. And I would say that's the key. We've got to understand that this is our World War II. This is our big enemy. And we seem to look for anything but. I mean, the Trump show is about distraction. It's about what stupid thing happened yesterday. This is the big fight. So focusing on that fight, as hard as it is, as much as it pushes against human nature, is the key.
Yeah. And this teacher also says thank you to both of you, and that she has been reading from the book to the students.
Really?
Yes. And the
Wonderful.
students think she's slightly obsessed with Theodore Roosevelt, but
That's all right. I'm not. I'm not complaining.
yeah. On the same page of the writing question, Henry David Thoreau, David Gessner, Theodore Roosevelt, as writers, obviously, to quote Thoreau, a lot of your motivation or ideas are to wake people up. Do you think writers play a major role in the environmental movement today? What do you have to say to those writers? Maybe those who are just starting out, who are scared, who maybe feel like the dried leaf, David, that you talk about in your book in the beginning?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm going to go a little opposite my earlier advice and say, start close to home and start small before you expand. I complained a little bit, and no offense to my friend Bill here, that of all these books with the end of, the doom of, the apocalypse of, I think it's important, as I just pointed out, to shake ourselves awake and understand what's at stake. But I also think that that attitude, which is how you get the media's attention after all, is a good example would be The Uninhabitable Earth, which I'm actually teaching tomorrow by David Wallace Wells, which is a great book, by the way. But it gets him on the shows because the world's ending. And so I do think that has to be balanced out by this is our only time on Earth. Thoreau said he was born in the nick of time. We weren't. We're a little further down the road of progress, but we're alive, and that joy is part of nature too. I mean, that's one of the reasons I turned to Roosevelt is, he's the only president I've ever heard of who said it's so much fun being president. Who's heard of that? And just really took a lot of physical delight in being out in wilderness. And I think that's the thing we forget when we're flipping through our cable, shows is how much fun it is. What a pleasure. It's encoded in human beings. This is all very recent, what we're talking about. For millions of years, this has been encoded in our evolving species to love being out in the natural world. And we just we gotta get out there, and then we gotta fight for it.
And I would say that life has no greater reward than to work hard at work worth doing.
Yeah. And I want to jump on that too, because I feel like, in my program where I teach graduate students and stuff, there's understandably a huge emphasis on sensitivity and a lot of these issues of the day. But I wouldn't be a writer if I didn't believe what Teddy just said. And I want to do a brown bag lunch with my students on toughness, on the importance of just getting punched in the face and keeping going. Because you're not going, no one's asking you to become a writer. I didn't publish my first book till I was 36, and I'd worked in Boston as a carpenter, and I'd worked as a bookstore clerk and in a homeless shelter. And it's just, it's something you just got to work and work and work at. And I don't know sometimes if people get that that's, you got to be talented, you got to be lucky, but you also have to just work.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually, I hate to say it, but I'm trying to get my daughter to watch Rocky for the first time. And in the book, I actually, Teddy, I say that when your dad told you to make your body,
yes,
I say it's like a high class, upper class Rocky montage of you doing calisthenics and barbells and, building up yourself.
Well, my father was a great inspiration to me. His advice was to take action. So whenever anything would happen, I've always said that in any situation, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing. The worst thing you can do, nothing.
And, actually, we didn't talk about that, but that's a theme in the book too, because mental health is a theme in the book. And obviously yours was fragile at 24 when you went out to the Badlands. And I've always felt, I fell into depression when I was about that age, partly because I was trying to write and not writing. And I actually feel that I'm of the same mind, that activity, there's a Samuel Johnson quote, activity contains within itself the seeds of its own reformation, which is a fancy way of saying, you know, don't sit around trying to think through how you're going to get out of this depression you're in. Take action. And you've got the famous black hair quote.
Yes. No, what I told my family after my wife and my mother passed in 1884 was that black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. So my goal was to go back to my ranches and outrun the cloud of gloom that had overshadowed me.
And people could also say that we're both, you know, repressors of darkness, and that we're not being psychologically complex by responding that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Churchill called it his black dog.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was trying to jostle out of himself.
Yeah, and in terms of being a writer, one of the questions also was dealing with rejection, especially for Teddy too. Like rejection in all forms is kind of universal, but would you two say it's the same thing with handling rejection? Is yes, building calluses, but also doing something instead of wallowing, if you will?
Oh, anytime I had a setback in my life, I would take action. So when I left the presidency in 1909, as Mr. Gessner said, that I felt that no man ever had as much fun being president as I did. And it left a great hole in my son's heart, he said, young Quentin, when we left the White House. And I felt the same way. So to counteract that, I went on a nearly year-long safari in Africa with the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History.
And here's another, you know, as a writer or any kind of artist, when you've poured your soul into something, you know, it hurts, obviously, for people to say, no, this is not up to snuff. I think one other lesson from Roosevelt is having things on various burners.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if ever there was a Renaissance person, Roosevelt would be writing books. You know, I said in the book, he's like a reality show unto himself. He'd be having adventures. He'd be doing these acts of state. He'd be having fun with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he had a varied life. And just like in nature, diversity is sustainability. Like it's a way to, so if you have a life where it's not all on the line with your writing, or all, you know, if you have a family that sustains you, or, you know, other aspects of your life, you're more able to withstand the blows, basically.
Mm-hmm. We have a question for Teddy. You are one of 4 presidents that have won the Nobel Peace Prize, Carter, Wilson, Obama. What would conversations be like with each of these presidents?
Well, being the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize, I felt mine was very well deserved, trying to settle the war between Russia and Japan. Each side sent the most stubborn representatives they could find. So in person, when we were together, they would argue about it. But off to the side, each one would come to me and present me with ideas that they wanted presented at the table as if they were my own. And when I would do that, they would reject those out of hand. So, but I think the conversation would be what we've done to help earn that. So what things we did that prompted those in charge to be able to not only nominate us, but to have that award presented and given to us. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to say a couple things about that. One is I wrote a Washington Post piece the morning of the first debate. It came out, and it was called Walking the Ridge.
Mm.
And Roosevelt saw his path in politics as being along a ridge,
Mm-hmm.
where on one side was kind of the avaricious, evil, you know, just people just in it for success and the money. And on the other were the dogmatic, you know, super liberal idealists who wouldn't budge from that stance. And I feel like we're in a similar position right now. Interestingly, he ends his essay by saying that he knows which one's worse. it's the man, he says, who succeeds unscrupulously through chicanery and stands as and cares only about success and stands toward society as a wild beast. And that's how the piece kind of ends, with not directly saying who that wild beast is, though we all know who it is. And the second one was kind of a Thoreauvian point. You mentioned Carter. He gets mocked for it, but the famous sweater speech, where he talks about doing with less and austerity, right before Reagan comes in and sweeps him out and says more, 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 and make America great, is perhaps the most Thoreauvian moment in the presidency, when he is, in the energy crisis, saying we've got to do, and he was so harshly mocked for that, and it's so obviously true, 50, 40 years later. So it's crazy.
Yeah. We have a few more questions. We are drawing down on our time, so folks who haven't asked their question, please do so, and we will get to them before we end. Next question, I think you both can answer this. In our world of COVID-19, it's obvious that people have found a deeper appreciation for nature. Do you think this will stick when the world goes back to normal? Do you think there's danger in this sticking, which you did cover in your book, David, like striking a balance between maybe loving nature too much, or, just being ignorant towards the land and the space that we do have?
Well, I call it in the next book, I call it kind of a rough draft for the fight against climate change. I know you mentioned that Bill McKibben spoke last week about this, and we haven't done nearly enough, but there are hints here of how the fight might proceed. Less flying around, less running around, staying closer to home. Here we are right now. I would have flown up there on a plane to Concord, and we would have all driven to the Walden Woods. We've learned a little bit. The degree, as I said earlier, nobody has really put it in stark terms. The degree to which we need to fight and to do with less is much larger and more urgent than we have experienced so far. One of my favorite quotes is Edward Abbey's, "Growth for growth's sake is the ideology of the cancer cell." And we seem to still cling to that as defining America. But what the Thoreauvian path shows is the alternate vision of America, which is as firm a tradition as the growth freaks tradition is.
Teddy,
I didn't answer the question, but I'm not a politician, so you can.
I guess, is there a danger, you think, of like an oversaturation of a place? Or do you think the appreciation of nature because of COVID-19, is there a danger in that?
No, if anybody proved you can find the world in a place, I've traveled a great deal in Concord. I happen to live on Hewlett's Creek, which is also known as Dawson's Creek from the TV show. So I'm in North Carolina on a fictional Cape Cod, Dawson's Creek. And, I learned for the first time we have otters on the other bank. I haven't seen one yet, but I'm looking. I've been paddling out to Masonboro Island and Barrier Island. So there's a world here that, I can discover.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think
you probably don't know what COVID is, but.
Well, we had the Spanish flu pandemic.
Yes.
There you go.
And that did affect our family as well. But no, I don't think you can ever tire of all that nature has. You should never tire of it. No matter how many times I visit the Badlands of North Dakota, each time it captivates me. And that's the area that I said that one person asked if I had to forget all my memories except one, what would I save? I said, my time as a Dakota rancher. That's how much that area influenced me. So no,
Didn't you also say that it looks like Poe's poetry sounds?
It looks like Poe's poetry sounds.
Poe's
Exactly.
writing.
Okay, so we have one last question, which I think you answered a little bit before. Tackling the climate crisis often feels daunting, as does tackling a lot of our current issues. And you mentioned earlier in your book that you feel as in control of events as a dried leaf riding a flooded river. Here at the WWP, we talk a lot about change through self-reformation. We're interested in what ways you cope with that feeling of dread. Is it through inspirational people like Henry David Thoreau and Teddy Roosevelt? Can one person make a difference, or does it take a larger group of people? So those are like 3 questions in one. So choose whatever one.
I think the people who are really effective, in the book, I briefly visit with Rick Bass in the Yak Valley in
I
Montana
love Rick Bass.
when I'm flying around the West. And I go into that in more depth in the forthcoming book. But he understands what I first learned working with the Environmental Defense Fund against DDT, or reporting on them working on it, which is a group's work, groups of people work. Henry wasn't a joiner. I'm not much of a joiner myself. I really, in the end, define myself more as a writer and artist than I do as an activist. But the people who are good at activism know that groups work. And our friend, the president here, do that on a larger scale than Rick Bass or others. And his groups were kind of what changed our country in a lot of ways. For me, conversely, I like to build things, whether it's a writing shack or a book. So those 3 or 4 hours in the morning before I have to come into here and fight off emails like I'm playing a game of Space Invaders, before I have to do that, are the pleasure of my day and the foundation of my day, and what allows me to do the other stuff because it makes me feel healthy and strong. But Teddy's your man on this one because he's the one who really changed things.
Well, I believe it takes each person doing their duty to make sure that as a whole, our society continues. So if each one of us does what we can collectively, we shall achieve more than if we rely on others to do it. And you know, the virtue that stays at home in the parlor and bemoans all the evil of the world is of little use. So we all need to take action.
Great. I think Thoreau would say maybe a slightly similar thing.
And if Teddy were in my house telling me to do that every day, I might be more of an activist.
Yeah, right.
Because I'd be kind of frightened.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. This was a lot of fun. I should really get one of those.
Thank you. Life that men praise and call successful is but one kind.
Awesome.
Yeah, I hear there's going to be a couple politicians, Teddy. If you want to stick around in the present for a while, they're going to be yelling at each other on something called television very soon.
Yeah, this was a good preface to what's to come.
That's right.
We didn't even plan that either.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward, David, to having you back with your new book.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I hope it's in person. I hope I can come up there.
Yeah, us too. Hopefully by then. And with that, everyone, thank you so much. As a reminder, we are a nonprofit. So for those who can donate, we appreciate it very much. But more than anything, we're thankful for the community. This event was recorded, so it'll be up on Walden.org in a bit. We just got a comment that says Teddy should debate Trump tonight. Really throw him off. So
it would really be great. They wouldn't call you Sleepy Teddy.
Mrs. Roosevelt says that I'm too old to run for office, though.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah.
Have a good night.
You too. Thanks, Teddy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.